Severance is about the mystery. It's about Lumon and the mysterious but important work. But really, the show is about its very first question.
Who are you?
Severance is about the question of who we are with our experiences, and who we are without. It's also about love, and the relationship between these two things. If you want to see my notes as I wrote this video, those are shared along with other collections of my thoughts over on Patreon. So as always, huge shout out to my patrons for their support for me and the channel. Lumon is this intentionally cold place, detached, clinical, soulless, and devoid of humanity on almost every level. To some extent, though, Lumon realizes that their innies are still people who need a semblance of human interaction to do their jobs, so that's given to them, in calculated, mechanical forms in line with Lumon philosophy. Stilted icebreaker games, melon parties, a 2-minute dance break. In this sense, Lumon is almost allergic to sincerity, a key ingredient in love, or really any meaningful interpersonal relationship.
Oh, a handshake is available upon request.
And this is true not just towards innies, but even between its higher ranks. When Milchick tries to have a human moment of vulnerability with Natalie, he is shut down, diplomatically and passively. There is no camaraderie here. Because, by definition, this is supposed to be the place where people don't have a personal life. And by depriving innies of any knowledge of it, maybe the idea is that they won't miss what they don't know. Innies can't live a full personal life, even on the severed floor, because that would defeat the purpose of their existence in the first place. To create people with no other focus or ambition beyond Lumon and the work. The Lumon Handbook, interestingly, actually has something to say regarding love. Romantic love may burn with a more luminous flame, but it's gone far more quickly than corporate affection, which persists even through generations. And so, I strongly oppose the view that this love rivals that which can exist in the industrial space between a person of means and a person of ability. This love, truer than any other, is the promised result of your service to me. This here tells us the kind of love that is valuable within Lumon. It really just depends on how we define this term, love. Here, this is a connection and affection, as Keir puts it, based by definition in a transaction between employer and employee, presumably towards the creation of a common goal. The relationship is based on the exchange, as he puts it, of means and ability. It is not, as we might define love in other ways, based on the innate value of a person. Not love as an end in and of itself, where the relationship is the uniting factor, based on people's mutual investment in each other's well-beings, but a love based in the work, in those achievements. So necessarily a love unequal by design. And of course, we don't have to take Keir's words at face value sincerity. We can concede that, sure, maybe he genuinely believes in these convictions, the way any zealot might. But there's also the obvious fact that pure love and service is not the only motivating factor for Lumon's hirings. You know, with the child labor and whatnot. The handbook goes on to say, toil, as we all know, can be wearisome. A worker may suffer injurious pain of ghastly dehumanization, and no workspace is without its perils. But whatever your task, dear worker, see that you perform it with love. And the use of the term love here also seems like kind of a thin platitude to justify what we know to be Lumon's abusive practices towards adults and children alike. Very much like any kind of cult leader and exploitative philosophy, telling you that you are suffering through or struggling through things in the name of this organization, in the name of this righteous cause and those above you, because you are told that it is innately fulfilling, whether or not you actually feel that. So perhaps the narrative setup seems love will be this force strong enough to overcome the manipulative, inhuman environment, to transcend severance. And yet, two people who loved each other deeply and want nothing more than to see each other, Mark and Gemma, still don't really recognize each other. The chip works. Still, there's more to consider. we're not just impacted by our conscious mind, but our subconscious. Helena and Mark, for example, connect while being outies because their subconscious recalls their bond. And crucially, because they are now in fully realized forms. But Gemma, as Mark meets her, is a version of herself with even less lived conscious experience than him. Mere hours.
My life has been 107 hours long. My favorite time was the 8 hours I spent in your department. It's the longest I've ever been awake.
The development of her personhood, the person that can connect and be connected with, seems to intentionally be kept as limited as possible. Not only that, she is even more stilted than the immediately severed Helly.
Upon request, I can also perform a hug.
There's almost no trace at all of her original personality, which leads us to wonder if she's not just severed, but either A, damaged in some way from her many other severings, or B, this version in particular is uniquely brainwashed in some way. And the answer really could go either way. This just isn't an equivalent comparison. Because Mark's love for Gemma is exactly what allows him to work on her file, what makes him indispensable. This is something that was confirmed in an interview post-season 2 finale by writer and producer Dan Erickson, who stated how, pause to read, the numbers are Gemma's soul, and the reason that Mark S can uniquely recognize it is because he loves her so much. Even without remembering the events and relationships that have shaped us, they've shaped us nonetheless. More on that in another video. During Irving's totally not sus dinner with Bert and his husband, Fields says,
I believe that innies deserve to experience love.
What does that mean? Deserve to experience affection? Closeness? Companionship? Of course, severed people can experience these emotions, but practically, what does that look like? And what does that mean for people who have the experience that innies do? Recently, in a conversation with a friend, I was asked how I would define or describe love. $1 million question. But a big part of the definition I did come away with was seeing someone and being seen. If love is energy, a conduit, then the most powerful, authentic love occurs between two complete people who are fully themselves, creating a continuous exchange of energy between people who care about, see, and want to continue to understand the other person, and feel that in return. You know how people sometimes say, you can only meet people as far as they've met themselves? The way you know yourself impacts how you relate to other people. So, therefore, if innies have a limited knowledge of themselves, what does it mean to love someone with half yourself? And what does it mean for someone in that position to love another innie? Someone who also has a limited knowledge of themselves. With both the Mark, Helly, and Bert Irving pairings, despite the eventual irony of who these people are on the outside, the relationship itself is endearing. It's sweet, it's honest, it's a little awkward and stilted, very much like teenagers in adult bodies experiencing a first love. Which brings up another question. What does it mean to love as a version of yourself that's only ever met 5 people, and 2 of them hate you? It doesn't mean that this connection is any less real or significant, but we could consider, to what extent are these 2 people reaching for the first person who's been kind to them, who they could plausibly be attracted to? What does it mean to love someone who doesn't know their own hobbies, what experiences have shaped them, the ones that have hurt them? A person who doesn't know their favorite songs, or remember their first breakup, or their best birthday. Again, if love is an exchange of energy, a conduit, by loving with half yourself, arguably, you're loving with that energy at half strength. And then there are the more practical questions. Okay, 2 innies fall in love, or let's say even develop a deep friendship. Then what? Can they go to each other's houses and hang out outside of work? What houses? However, there's also the opposite case to be made, that severed innie people can actually love more authentically. Because just because they don't have memories of their past doesn't make innies less themselves. One could argue, in some ways, it makes them more themselves. So in some ways, these are people connecting with each other without any interference from their environment, as distilled, true versions of themselves. In this sense, do innies love in the most pure way because they're unburdened by expectations or baggage. They're just people living in the moment. And in addition, innies might arguably value these connections more precisely because real connection and joy within Lumon is intentionally made scarce. By design, these people are put into a scarcity mindset when it comes to interpersonal relationships, authentic expression, and, in some ways, happiness itself. The connection between innie Dylan and his wife, for example, seems to be in some ways stronger and warmer than it is on the outside. What does it mean for a severed person to be loved by an unsevered person? This is Dylan, unaffected by the monotony and stress of everyday life. A Dylan who can't take his wife for granted, as sometimes happens, because seeing her is presented to him as a rare and exciting reward. This is part of why they're both drawn to each other. For her, this is an opportunity to see the parts of her husband without the wear and tear of daily life, who looks at her with the wonder and newness of the way a relationship begins. For him, it's precious because it's the first and only time he's ever had anything like this. And again, that's kind of exactly the problem. When his wife breaks up with him as an innie, his reaction is, again, teenage, adolescent, almost childlike. Part of his draw to her is, of course, that subconsciously he's been married to her. But the other part of this intense attachment is that this is the first person he's ever had this kind of attention from. And fundamentally, these people can't be equals. The way that we love and interact interpersonally grows as we do with our experiences. We can better navigate our relationships, ideally, the more we engage with other people, learning what we like, what we don't like, what makes us feel cared for, what makes us angry, how we react when we're hurt. But innies neither love with the knowledge and experience of the past or the baggage of the past. There's no anxiety over compatible lifestyles or habits or schedules because they simply don't really know their own or those of others. So in some ways, this makes love between innies simpler, for better and for worse. Simpler because they have little comparison, simpler because they have both fewer things to connect over and fewer to conflict over. Because severed innie people experience a much narrower set of life experiences and therefore much narrower emotional development by design. Not to get all inside out, but part of developing as a person is, as we continue to experience a greater breadth of life, our perception of events, our emotions themselves become more nuanced and complex. Miss Huang objects to Milchick allowing a funeral for Irving because it, quote, makes them feel like people. We could interpret this a couple ways. The they referring to Irving and other terminated employees as not really people and therefore not worth a mourning ceremony. And/or that allowing innies to mourn and grieve would be legitimizing their emotions and connections, an idea incompatible with the existence and purpose of innies in the first place. Innies are intentionally cut off from the full spectrum of the human experience because they cannot, by definition, be agents in their own life. When Helena says,
I am a person. You are not.
this is part of what she means. They're not free. They're considered not people, not for any innate quality, but because they're not allowed to be people. While on the severed floor, it's as if they're presumed to not have the same needs, the same desires and emotions as when they're above, and are treated as though they don't. Which brings us to the other problem with innies experiencing love, either from another innie or someone else. If you loved someone, wouldn't you want them to be free? Wouldn't you want to see them thrive? Wouldn't you want them to be able to live outside of Lumon? But the catch is that if they left, you know that the way that person exists, with that restricted spectrum of memories and experiences, would essentially die as you know them. Regardless, the choice to prioritize bonds with other people, love, within Lumon for innies is a radical declaration of autonomy from people who have never been allowed to experience that. This is the kind of love that, at this point, seems completely incompatible with Lumon's philosophy. A love not based on the outcome of a person's work, but between people without a means to an end. The kind of love that can't be demanded or even promised as some kind of end result, like Keir says, but that can only be given freely.